Hello, everyone. I am Tommaso Valletti. I'm the director of the RPN Research Policy Network of CEPR on competition policy. I'm delighted to introduce a new webinar today on designing bi-European policies for strategic autonomy. First of all, I'm very grateful for CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR, which is hosting us. Our RPN tries to connect academic research and policy making to make informed decision and inform also what the policymakers are doing with our work. And today, the topic that we selected a few months ago couldn't be more timely. We didn't expect the turbulence in the market and all the problems with the tariffs that we are witnessing, but definitely we are going to be talking about that. So trade policy, industrial policy, competition policy to enhance the strategic autonomy and resilience of Europe is the topic for the day. The roadmap of that is in the Draghi report, which is at the basis of many of the discussions that we are having. So we'll be talking about major industrial policy initiatives. We will talk about bi-European. We'll talk about rethinking our digital infrastructure. So we have an hour and a half. I should tell everybody that this meeting is being recorded and it will be made available on different social media very soon after the end of this. There are 6 distinguished speakers. We have decided to pack them in 3 different slots. In the first lot, Sander, who's recently joined the steering committee of the RPN, we're very happy with that, will be moderating Ufuk and Moritz. Then it will be Christina talking to Beth and Dietmar. And hopefully last but not least, it will be myself moderating a conversation with Martin and Giancarlo. So that's all from me. And I'll pass it on to Sander for the first block. Each block it will be about 25 minutes. And if we are on time, at the end of everything, there will be a conversation among the panelists. You can put some comments and questions in the chat, although I'm not sure we will have time to go through them. They're always useful, though, to have counterpoints from the audience that we can read and give to our speakers later on. Now, everything passes to Sander. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Tommaso, and indeed, very relevant, great topic. I thought I would set the scene for a few minutes before handing over to Ufuk. We've been discussing this bi-European push in policy circles. It's part of the EU's Clean Industrial Deal. It's part of the debates, frankly, on defense. And I think there are sort of larger economic reasons to care about industry. And I would mention 3. One is that productivity growth in the EU, the little productivity growth we've seen in the last 10 years, has in fact come from industry. So if you look at the 10 sectors in the large 5 Eurozone countries, the top productivity sectors, if you will, they've all been basically mid-tech industries. The second reason to care is that there's really a lot of crossover between clean tech and defense, a kind of dual use, if you will. Think of batteries for electric vehicles, also an indispensable input for drones, which in all the tragedy we see is a relevant piece of kit in the war in Ukraine. And the third reason, I think, for Europeans to care about their industry is that it's really essential in the transatlantic relationship. Actually, because American industrial capacity cannot match its demand, the EU has long run a very large surplus in goods trades with the US, and it is dominated by, surprise, surprise, machines, cars, and chemicals. And so those 3 reasons, I think, are one of the core sort of backdrops for which to think about this. And it's actually also not surprising that the EU outproduces the US in any relevant category of industry. We produce more steel, we produce more cars, we produce more planes, we produce more ships. So that's that. But of course, that surplus is part of the frustration of the Trump administration with the European Union. And the tariffs will hurt, even if they've been scaled back from 20 to 10% on the EU. with, of course, all the uncertainty surrounding it. And let's not forget that there are a number of sectoral tariffs on autos, on pharma, which is coming, that will hurt European exports to the US, which are around 3% of EU GDP. So if you look at most modeling, it's realistic to assume that we will lose, let's say, somewhere around 20% of those exports to the US. There's another shock hitting the European economy and hitting our industry specifically, which is China's export-led growth model, which continues to basically be profoundly unbalanced. China's goods trade surplus with the world over the last 12 months has now reached $1.1 trillion, up from 1 trillion over the 4 quarters before on a rolling basis. And you see it in European trade with China. China's exports to the EU in the latest release 2 days ago were up by 10% year over year. The EU's exports to China were down by 7.5%. That's an 18 percentage point gap. And you see the same for Germany, for France, and other European countries. Now, there are a number of second round effects from the Trump tariff shock and the China shock. The first is obviously that as China loses access to the American market and its goods basically bounce off the 100-something% tariff rate that's now in place, there's a real risk that China will redirect its excess production to the European market. So this is really the key risk on von der Leyen's mind. You see it, she talks about it every second day. The second, I think risk here is that even if Europe defends itself from Chinese dumping with safeguards, with its trade defense instruments, we will still lose export market shares even more rapidly around the world because these Chinese goods have to go somewhere. And if they don't go to Europe, they'll go to Indonesia, to India, to Brazil, and other places. Now, there are some upsides as well. First of all, the tariffs of the US on China are far greater than those on Europe. And so on a relative term, European firms are in some ways gaining competitiveness in the American market. And the second, I think, upside is that insofar as we import even cheaper goods from China in sectors that we don't care about, like textiles or consumer electronics, there's a kind of consumer surplus that comes into play, which I think provides space to actually do industrial policy in areas that we care about. So you raise prices, let's say on cars a little bit, to make sure that the European car sector survives, and you can kind of cross-subsidize that from a consumer standpoint with cheaper electronics or t-shirts or shoes or whatever. Now, what can Europe do in terms of policy to respond to this, what I would call the Chinese hammer and the American anvil, and we're caught in the middle? The first and obvious move is to increase domestic demand in Europe so that we're less dependent on exports, and Germany's fundamental shift in fiscal policy to the sum of 2% of GDP and extra fiscal stimulus over the next 10 years, really a staggering change in German fiscal policy, is exactly the right policy at exactly the right time. But just more demand doesn't really create demand for, strategic industries, which is why we're having this debate today. How do you do directed demand into the industries that we care about with local content requirements, with Buy European provisions in public procurement or in subsidy schemes? So that's, I think, the debate that we are having here. And I'm really thrilled to first give the floor to Moritz to provide his reflections on this debate and how to do Buy European or local content well, and then to switch to Ufuk. So Moritz, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Sander. And first of all, apologies for somewhat on the move here. So I hope all the connections are stable. And I can make essentially the 3 points I wanted to make. First of all, but let me praise Sander and team here for putting on this exceptionally timely webinar. And I think it is exactly the questions that Sander just outlined that are also occupying us at the Kiel Institute very much these days. For those of you who followed our work, we're running a quantitative global trade model almost on a hourly basis these days. So whenever there are new announcements, we will check and look at what the likely impact is going to be across the world, obviously with a particular focus on what's going on in Europe. And I think just to reiterate what Sandra just said, it is in the context of these of this trade model, of our kite model. But the Peterson model or the Mirage model of CEPR will give you very similar results. The dominant effect that we see is, of course, of these new trade regime that the Trump administration has implemented is substantial self-harm to the US. It's a slight harm to the Chinese economy. And in these models, in the model, the European economy is a little bit of a loser, as are other economies around the world. But it's clearly not the main loser. I think that's an important point to keep in mind. There are going to be price effects, and these price effects are going to be substantial, in the sense that it's going to be inflationary, at least on a one-time basis for the US. The best estimate that you get out of these sort of complex multi-country, multi-sector general equilibrium models is still, although they have all kinds of mechanisms built in that probably, tend to not overestimate the effects. If anything, the effects coming out of these models tend to be a little bit small. Output, we think it's maybe 1.5%, 2% negative shock for the US, maybe 1% a shock or so for China, and 20 or 30 basis points for Europe. On the price side for the US, we're still talking about a 4 percentage point one-time inflation shock. So that's a substantial amount, making the Fed's business very difficult going forward, being at the same time dealing with a weakening economy and a substantial cost push. For Europe, on the price side, the ECB's job will get easier, as we have a sort of disinflationary environment, and that's very strong in China. So that's sort of the background, how we think about the world. Right now, that's my first important point. What Sandra also mentioned, trade diversion is the topic of the day, coming on top of substantial gains in Chinese market shares in recent years, and especially in industries that are dear to the European social compact, such as automotives and machinery. So the effects that, if you think about this sort of in a structured way, we're talking about a collapse of Chinese-US trade, in the short run, probably by somewhere about 40 to 50% if things stay the way they are. So now there are reasonable people who say, like, this is just too big. We cannot deal with 40, 50% collapse in trade between US and China. Ergo, things can't stay that way, and we shouldn't really bother calculating this. I wouldn't be so sure. I would say there's a decent chance that a substantial share of these tariffs are there to stay, and we'll maybe get back to real negotiations in 90 days. My recent visit to Washington just confirmed that there is a much deeper and much broader agenda of the Trump administration to stick with these. Stick with these tariff regimes. But the trade diversion is in the magnitude of maybe adding 5% of, I think that's even the upper bound of imports from China to Europe. There are other regions that are hit as hard, but 5%, and we're talking about an additional 20 billion or so in Chinese imports coming towards Europe. That overall, with a 20 trillion economy, seems manageable. But certainly there will be sectors in which these effects will be very hard. So how do we get out of this? I think Sander also there mentioned some of the points that we've made in Kiel. The security situation has changed dramatically. We have much bigger threat from the east, and we have much weaker insurance in the west. So building up European defense is, a political security policy necessity, but it's also it's not where we do it, but it's also an opportunity for the economy, in the sense that what we're preparing for, and there's, I think, a mistaken and if you will, misguided view in parts of the public, but also in the profession, that by definition, defense investment is somehow dead investment, and it's just about tanks that you put in a big garage and that start to rot and rust. Ethan Nilzetsky of the LSE did a great study for us recently for the Keeler Institute, where he kind of debunked a lot of these myths and evidence we have from serious academic work on defense multipliers, on the productivity.
Oops.
Moritz, I think we lost you for a second.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Okay,
No,
keep
sorry.
going. Defense multipliers, please tell us.
Exactly. So it's also my almost my last point. So and I'll talk about procurement about European. That's the last one then. So I think the important point is that sort of defense warfare of tomorrow will be autonomous systems, it will be network systems, it will be AI based, it will involve space and satellite constellations, it will involve things like iron domes and electronic warfare. So by definition, these are high-tech investment opportunities, and these are exactly the sectors where Europe is lagging behind the US and China. It's exactly the sectors where our productivity developments have been really weak, and where we lack so far the scale to effectively compete. And I think defense is the part of the economy, or the sort of the wider sort of political and economic scene where you want goods to be homemade to the extent possible, to be able to have them when you most need them. Defense investment is a form of insurance against disaster risk, and it's a form of deterrence that makes disasters less likely. So I think there the case is particularly strong. And as the last point, the recent evidence that we have from Paulo Surico's papers and others forthcoming in the AR is that the productivity effects, even in the long run of defense investments, if done correctly, if mostly in R&D and high-tech mission-oriented ways, can be substantial. How do we do this? Third point, how do we spend it? Obviously on high tech, but the procurement situation is key. And I think maybe to bring in one last practical element, the way America does it is to have always dual procurement. So there's always two firms that produce the same military equipment. And I think a great option for Europe would be to copy this American system. There is also evidence that this helps spread the technologies, the productivity across the industry. So it's not just one or two big guys who get to internalize all the income and the technological developments, but you spread it more widely. And B, I would suggest that to build European resilience, we require procurement to have dual sourcing, so dual procurement from two different companies. And I would say we should require one of these companies to come from a different member state of the European Union to also help build that sort of pan-European military base. Very, very last word is we have an obvious problem in all these policies with incumbents, with political economy, with the typical industrial policy issues, that it's the existing elephants who sit on the table. Also here, my bet and my money would be on defense tech, because these new startups, these defense tech companies are much more European. They're not sort of a part of the nation state setup for the past 150 years. And they think automatically in terms of economies of scale that can only be realized across Europe. So also from that political economy problem, I think the way for Europe to go on these issues is go high tech and go defense tech. Well, thanks. I'll stop it here and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks again, Sander, for giving me the opportunity to speak.
No, thank you, Moritz. And you yourself are a dual use good, because you're on your way to a television interview and speaking to us whilst driving, I think. So I'm very impressed with your own dual use capabilities. Ufuk, I would pass to you to tell us a bit about the American experience. We've talked now a bit about defense. My own personal heart is very much in clean tech, and I think there's also a case for some strategic sectors there to work with procurement and by European conditionalities in subsidy schemes to survive the pressure from China. And of course, the US, where you're based, has experimented a lot, particularly under Biden, with such policies. And you also know a lot about what it means for small firms. So please enlighten us on those aspects.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Sander. And thanks, Tommaso, for organizing such an important event. So, so I'm a growth economist, and I care about how economies perform, especially in the longer run. And of course, industrial policy can influence employment in two ways. Either, you can make hiring cheaper, so as a result, firms go and create more jobs in an induced way. Or, firms can improve their productivity and technology, and then naturally or organically hire more people and create more jobs. The former is quicker, and for some reason it's more preferred by policymakers, but the latter is the harder one, and it takes time. It takes a long time actually to build new technologies, and then put those technologies into action, and then end up hiring. But that's the high quality way of going in the long run. And I perceive the recent policy interventions in the second category, which is the CHIPS Act and Inflation Reduction Act, which the name of the second one is a bit probably unfortunate, or whether it's really aiming for reducing the inflation. But as I said, these higher quality interventions will take longer time. So that's why it is difficult to judge the return to those investments yet, because it's been barely 2 years, and the disbursement also is taking time. And as a result, now at least early indicators in terms of the investment are positive. So last year, the investment on the firm side has been strong, which means that firms are reacting positively to these incentives. But at the same time, this should not be a surprise, because if we make the cost of investment cheaper through these policies, investment should go up. The bigger question is, what are we getting in return socially, right? That's the big question, because making policy intervention is easy, and some things will go up. The question is, from a social point of view, do we get what was planned? And that's why I think we have to also look at the earlier policies, and because since these are slow-moving objects, probably it will take time for us to realize the actual return to the current policies. But looking historically, for instance, the past experiences, these industrial policies, especially that were implemented in the form of tax credit, have disproportionately benefited larger firms. And in this platform, and in many other platforms, we've been increasingly thinking and worrying about market concentration. A lot of people in this group have thought about this, worked on this issue. And in the before all this debate started, we've been discussing the rise in market concentration as an important issue or concern. And we were discussing how to make things more competitive. Now, in recent work with Nathan Goldschlag, we looked at using census data. We looked at which firms are claiming tax credit from the government. Of course, it's disproportionately the very large firms. But this has a consequence, because if large firms are effectively benefiting from tax credit, it means that resources are being moved, innovative resources especially, are being reallocated towards larger players in the market. And then the question is, should we be worried about this? The same resource, does it matter if it's being used by smaller firms or larger firms? The theory is very strong on this, and the empirical evidence is also starting to come out quite strong on this. Firms have different incentives. If they are big players versus if they are smaller players who are trying to prove themselves to the market and trying to make room for themselves in the market, they have very different incentives. And we see that, for instance, when you look at the same inventor moving from smaller firm to larger firm, what happens in equilibrium is the wages are rising significantly for those inventors, but those inventors are becoming less innovative after moving to a large incumbent. Probably, there might be bureaucracy, there might be differential incentives that are being imposed, but long story short, I would like to look at these things from a bigger picture, and reallocating resources towards larger firms should be thought carefully, or at least the way the policies are implemented are effectively moving these resources to larger firms. And again, let's look from a long run point of view. We know that even though there might be superstar firms today, tomorrow we need again superstar firms to create jobs, to create technologies. But tomorrow's superstar firms are today's small and young businesses. Now the question is, are we providing them the healthy environment for them to nurture and grow? Let's look at the numbers. So we, together with my colleagues and in partnership with Intuit, so we developed a new small business index, which keeps track of the small business employment health near real time, basically. And when I talk about small businesses, these have at most 9 workers and less, and they are 77% of US businesses. Okay, so we are talking about really a big majority in terms of the business counts. And what we are seeing is that post-COVID, especially since the inflation went up and the interest rates start to go up, employment share of small businesses have been declining steadily. Even though the overall job market has been resilient and strong, when we look at the composition again, it's been declining. Another important thing is, of course, financing for these businesses. So these businesses require financing. And 2 weeks ago, we start to circulate a new paper where we are showing that over the recent 2 years, the way small businesses are financing themselves are using their credit cards to finance themselves. So credit card use have doubled. And obviously, this is the most expensive way of financing someone's business. And when we look at, so if they are paying back, this is not a problem. But when we look at the balance, they are carrying 60% more balance from month to month. And the delinquency rate has also increased significantly. Now, these numbers tell us that first, the policies are reallocating resources towards larger firms. And in the meantime, small businesses are struggling in terms of the resources that they can access to. And this is, maybe from today's point of view, with the existing technologies, we are very excited about them. But we have to also think about tomorrow. And tomorrow's technologies will emerge from today's young and smaller businesses. And as a result, their health should be an important concern for us. Another important issue, of course, is that new technologies such as AI, they are typically implemented or brought to the market by younger businesses, because incumbents are struggling for various reasons. They have less incentive or they have less familiarity. They are not bringing AI tools as much, but the younger businesses do. So as a result, their health is particularly critical, both for the US and for Europe. And just, I'm running out of time, but just one quick sentence on Europe. I think, for Europe's innovativeness, clearly, again, entrepreneurship, young businesses are super important, but historically, we know that new business formation have been, at least for instance, in countries like Germany, for instance, have been almost 50% of the US entry rate and entrepreneurship rate. So the overall ecosystem is different, right? The overall structure is different. There's a lot of discussion around deregulation, but I think deregulation is just the tip of the iceberg. So we have to really, especially when it comes to Europe, we have to think about the whole ecosystem. And we should not forget that, the education system is different. Failure is punished very differently, both socially and in terms of the capital markets. And there are many things. The university structure is very different in Europe compared to the US, and how they are pumping new ideas and basic science into the whole ecosystem so that firms can build on it. So that's why I think this has to be thought in a bigger picture. And of course, new policies require 27 members agreeing on the same thing, and that by design is introducing more sluggishness in the EU context compared to the US, as opposed to one center deciding, as we saw in the recent steps, how quickly things can be moved. So that's why, when it comes to comparison of Europe and US, there are significant differences where a lot of things have to be thought in the European context itself. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Ufuk. My personal takeaway listening to you is that you hear this sometimes in EU policymaking circles, is you cannot do Draghi in pieces. You have to do it at large, the package. And I think that's my takeaway from you is you have to think of the whole ecosystem and not just only doing a bit of industrial policy, only a little bit of this or that. And maybe to add one point, what's interesting with industrial policy is that you can actually raise the return on success, right? So if you basically create demand in sectors you care about, then for small entrepreneurs, it may be more worth it initially to move into those sectors, in addition to all the other great points you made on not punishing failure too much. I would hand over, I think, at this stage to the next panel. Thanks so much.
So it's me, it's Cristina Cafara. I am a co-founder of this research policy network and organize a number of these events. So I want to shift at this point from this fascinating discussion to the digital space, which is very much, of course, at the core of the discussion we're having in Europe about strategic sectors that we need to power up. Sander talked about dual uses between clean tech and defense. There is, of course, as much and more dual use as between digital and defense. So it is in the area of these critical sectors that need particular attention. And the reality of our digital ecosystem, not to put too fine a point on it, is that while we have, of course, done our best to try and tame the large platforms at the level of apps and services, the reality remains and has, in fact, worsened significantly over time, that at every level of the digital stack, starting from chips to connectivity, to compute, to cloud, to cables under the ground, effectively European players are increasingly marginalized, and Europe is increasingly a colony of the United States. And this is concerning, of course, in geopolitical terms in the current environment, because we have the problem we don't have the kill switch for many of these kind of levels of the stack. So with that in mind, there is a significant movement in Europe, which is now essentially raising alarm about our dependencies and the need to do more to shift effectively towards a more sovereign landscape. This is an inevitability in terms of desirable outcomes, but can we do it and how? So the idea of buying European, which is where the idea of this webinar really comes, really is very central at this point in digital, because steering demand in that direction is clearly very important. But let me introduce, I want to hear, of course, from our speakers. The first one is Dietmar Harhoff. He needs an introduction, professor at Munich, IP scholar. He's director of research at the Max Planck Institute, and involved in multiple initiatives, such as an agency for radical innovation in Germany. So clearly ideally placed at that intersection between academia, technology, entrepreneurship, public sector, and all that. Dietmar, will you give your views from your particular vantage point as to, of course, the situation in Europe is dire, is serious. What can be done through policies like mandates on our public sector, on the private sector, to, for example, buy European technology? Do they exist? Are they good enough? Can we steer demand? And what else can we do in order to reduce our dependency? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So thank you. So let me add to the discussion that we have had right now, and that is, of course, very much characterized by the tariff issues and so forth. Picking up the dependency topic. And if we think about the situation right now, we're looking at no great changes in the technology, but maybe the willingness of certain players to use the kill switch that Christina just alluded to, also for sort of putting pressure on former partners. And that, of course, has led to a loss of trust between the United States and Europe. So we're thinking about more than in the past about maintaining independence and control to the largest degree possible. And to answer one of Christina's questions up front, I think that we have a lot of the technologies that are needed for that. We have not been using them smartly. We have not been using our procurement possibilities smartly in the past. And I will allude to a lack of strategic capabilities in our public sector that has led to some of this demise. I've chatted with a number of people, Rafael Laguna, who heads this agency of radical innovation in Germany, Bert Hubert, who is a tech expert and has thought a lot about Eurostack, which is, of course, here in the background. And given that US and US companies are no longer the highly reliable partners we thought of, we have to think about what are sort of the most disruptive and most immediate effects that could happen if somebody pulled that switch that we have been talking about. And I think that that immediately gives us a list of priorities where we want to have our government services, healthcare services, safety and security, infrastructure, border control, and stuff like that, mostly in a Euro stack. So I support this concept very much because I think it is essential to maintain our possibilities of acting in our own interests. If shoe stores go with US tag, well, we have no shoes maybe, but it's vastly more dangerous to have a strong dependency in the others. By the way, I think that universities and public research organizations have been particularly bad in being sucked into a US-dominated world, although they would have had the capabilities of going open source. And that open source and similar structures or technologies are now becoming available and are a reliable source of having, for example, IT infrastructure in the public sector. You can see that, for example, in Germany, in the state of Schleswig-Holstein that has decided to go fully into that kind of technology and the stack. Let me ask a few key questions for the Euro stack concept. Let's assume we have these priorities, we develop them, and I think we need to have more discussion on that. I'll just very brief here, right? How do we get to implementation? Now, first of all, the EU, the member states have tremendous procurement power. We have been talking a lot about that, and it has also found a lot of attention now among CEPR scholars, economists, and so forth. So we can work with the demand that is there, and we need to do that probably more smartly than in the past. I will not go into particular mechanisms, for example, imposing non-negotiable demands to vendors to have the cloud in Europe, to have it managed by certain firms and so forth, or the possibility of having price premium for Euro stack type technologies. I think that we can handle with the toolbox of economists very nicely. But I think there is more, and I want to alert you to the fact that in many, many cases, we do not have the capabilities in our public sector for systematic reasons, okay? So technological and management capabilities and organizational agility in our public sector are missing. We often administer and govern out of ignorance. Our bureaucrats often do not have a deep understanding of industry. We make it hard to hire the people who have that understanding. Doing industrial policy without that understanding is a silly proposition. We need to bring more expertise of that into government. We don't just need these folks as consultants, we need them as key players and employees. Those of you who know the literature of courts having technical expertise before the bench and behind the bench know that having that before the bench just as expert witnesses is not sufficient. You need that in the discussion. And for that, we need agency-type organizations that have more leeway than we give classically to public sector organizations. I've been, for the past 10 years, involved with an effort of this kind. And we have... Oh, thank you. The Agency for Radical Innovation in Germany. And I can tell you that it's a hard push to give these agencies the liberties that they need to have in order to make what I just said reality.
Keys
Yes.
to your car.
Okay.
Oh, there they are.
Okay, so we have that partially with the EIC, but we do not find, I think, in Europe the right balance typically between giving leeway and being under the permanent control, the annual control, the budgetary control of the controller generals and so forth. So we need to think about that. We need to bring tech and industry experience into capable organizations, and bureaucracy needs to give up the illusion to have perfect control down into the tiniest detail of implementation of innovation policy and industrial policy. So we need to come to other types of governance here. And of course, we need to think about the coupling. Ufuk said that procurement and tech development in Europe, bringing also the military sector. Sander did mention that is becoming very important. As to economics, I think we have dumbed down a highly strategic and complex matter to almost pricing alone in competition economics. So most economists have a comparatively naive view of technology, and our competition authorities have neglected innovation on a regular basis, and that has not served us well. So we need to understand technology in more detail and have a major upgrade in how we integrate that in innovation and competition policy. So to do that, I think we need more technocrats in government. We need more technology types in governments, not just lawyers and economists. Sorry for speaking against my own profession to some degree. And we also need to think about how to do smart monitoring and controlling. Old-style controlling, general, as in the German Bundesrechnungshof, don't cut it. We need a portfolio approach, just as venture capitalists look at a multitude of investments and possibly bring a few of them to fruition, and others may just fail. And that is not a reflection on managerial incompetence. That's just the risk structure that we're facing there. Returning back to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, and I subscribe to everything you say, and also thank you for the warm endorsement to the concept, at least, of Eurostack. Implementation is another matter, but it is something that I think we need to keep in our sight. But of course, your discussion was broader and extended beyond procurement, which is essential, to also competences and the way in which we make decisions. Now, I want to move on to Beth Balzan. This discussion started off with trade, and trade comes back here now because, of course, one of the things we hear in Europe when we discuss this kind of policies to favor European procurement, for example, favor European sellers over other types of sellers, is but we are at risk. We shouldn't be doing that because it could run counter or can create risk in terms of trade rules. Whether there are still trade rules is unclear, but there is a strong view that somehow a strong body of resistance. We ought to be very careful about this tampering with procurement rules, lest we fall foul of the god of WTO. So Beth Balzan was senior advisor to the former trade minister of the United States, Catherine Tai. So she has been, she's left that position only a few weeks ago when there was a change in administration. And I would like you, Beth, to, as someone who has been steeped into these WTO issues for years in your position, to enlighten us a bit as to what is the real risk that we in Europe would potentially face if we were to be brave and go out and decide we want to procure European as a preferential channel. Are we exposed to litigation risks? How do we think about that? What's your view as someone who has been really in the weeds and in the eye of the storm on this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today for this conversation. So I thought where I would start is actually to connect the conversation that's happening in Europe right now across the board, Eurostack, defense, with what every government experienced during the pandemic. which is finding out you've become too dependent on another economy, that you're exposed to risks and vulnerabilities that you now have to correct for. This is a discussion about strategic autonomy, and that is partly what strategic autonomy is about. And I think to eventually come to the question you've asked about litigation risk, I think we have to understand that interdependence was the mantra of the free trade era. If we say the free trade era was the end of the Cold War until the pandemic, the WTO was created during that era, the idea was that more integration is always better and fragmentation is always bad. I think the IMF actually continues to talk in this framework. We should be moving past that in light of lessons from the pandemic. We learned in the pandemic that if interdependence means you have concentrated supply chains so that your own people don't have access to masks or personal protective equipment or ventilators during a public health crisis, that's a problem. We need to fix that. Equally, if interdependence means you have a digital infrastructure that is not free from influence from people, companies, or governments whose interests don't align with your own, that's also a risk and vulnerability that governments might want to correct for. It's interesting to hear the conversation today. When I was working in the Biden administration, there was a group in the White House that was running a digital sovereignty conversation. And I think a lot of people would say, great, that's terrific. It was actually, it was a group that was focused on protectionism. Digital sovereignty was equated with protectionism. And I didn't do a lot with that group, partly because I didn't agree with the premise. If somebody invokes the specter of protectionism, you ought to ask what it is they're trying to protect. If you're trying to protect your sovereignty, that is something we should all be respectful of. That's not something that has been baked into the conversation in light of this view that all interdependence is always good. So, Christina, to your point that Europeans are often squeamish about things like buy European, about procurement, about local content. Oh no, to your point, the god of the WTO. I love the way you put things. I will say that kind of messaging appeared when we were in the Biden administration trying to negotiate with Europe a green steel and aluminum deal. And there was a lot of discussion over whether that was going to be compliant with WTO rules. We thought it was, but it shows you the degree to which this mentality can obstruct what I think would have been a very good outcome, and what in fact European industry would have thought would have been a good outcome. So it does act in a way to obstruct the things we might want to do together. I think part of the reason this messaging is so prevalent in Europe is because it is a narrative that comes out of Brussels, that we should elevate fealty to WTO rules and trade commitments above other priorities. I think the most important thing to be able to convey today is that that's actually not the reality of how the European Union operates. Even when the European loses a WTO dispute, they sometimes don't come into compliance. The EU already makes decisions about what its political economy requires and will not come into a compliance if those priorities are deemed higher than paying homage to the god of the WTO. So I think that's important, not only to perspective on how the European Union actually behaves in reality, but also because that kind of outcome is actually a good outcome. It's the kind of outcome that the founders of the multilateral trading system in the 40s expected. That's one of the things they thought was significant. Respect for sovereignty. They baked it into the system that they designed. One of the American negotiators actually wrote his memoirs about those negotiations and identified 3 areas where governments are most likely to have domestic considerations override their international commitments: agriculture, national security, and government procurement. And that, of course, is the buy European part. I think this is actually going to become only more significant now that Europe is figuring out how to provide for its own security. as it needs to build out. I was going to say reindustrialization, but Sandra has reminded me that there already is a very strong industrial base in Europe. But once you're trying to figure out how to defend yourself against existential threats, that will very quickly put your trade commitments in perspective. I do have a couple of cautions for Europeans who are interested in trying to figure out a way forward that does respect their sovereignty, recognizing the disruption, shall we say, from Tariff Liberation Day. I'm seeing proposals like 0 for 0 duties on industrial products, or reaching for the old playbook of comprehensive trade agreements, or even things going on at the WTO like the e-commerce negotiations, which I think has implications for the Euro stack. We should understand that those tools are largely from that era of interdependence is always good, and that those types of arrangements have in important ways contributed to the kind of overdependence that Europeans are now trying to figure out how to address. In my view, for example, the reason so much of the hardware for digital products is made in the PRC is because of the Information Technology Agreement at the WTO, which had 0 for 0 duties on those products. In my view, those old approaches are likely to interfere with rather than help European industrial goals. I think that Europeans need to be really careful about supply chain rules to make sure they're incentivizing the kind of integration that we're talking about here today, really being conscious of Europe's industrial base. On our way out in January under the Biden administration, we put out a paper on supply chain resilience. It's designed to try to chart a path forward based on the lessons we learned from the pandemic. I think the paper is still available. If not, I have a copy. So just to summarize, as with the pandemic, Europe's trying to solve for an overdependence problem, and it's important for people to make sure they're using the right tools to achieve it. Things have changed, and the way we think about these issues has to change too.
So this is fascinating, and it is to me, the sort of the takeaway from this segment is, of course, from Dietmar, a strong endorsement from a European perspective, but also from a technologist perspective and an economist perspective of a strategy to power up our own capabilities. But from Beth, what I think is especially significant, and really people should open their ears to this, we as Europeans cannot be cowed into somehow being fearful that objectives that are absolutely paramount, like security and ultimately democracy, can be in some way secondary to some fealty, as you put it, Beth, to WTO rules, to international trade rules that in a way are not really shouldn't be staying in the way, shouldn't be in the way of that. So I find that this particular discussion extremely important and encouraging for what we need to do in digital. So let me hand over to Tommaso for the final segment, which I think is going to discuss how, as competition economists, we think about this and what contribution we can make.
Indeed. Thanks a lot to everyone so far. Thank you, Christina. So the RPN is an RPN on competition policy. So now we're bringing competition in the picture, and I have two excellent speakers, Martin Snoep and Giancarlo Spagnolo. And I thought I would start actually with Martin first. Martin is the chairman of the Dutch Authority for Consumers and Markets, ACM. So I'm going to provoke you, Martin, as it is a common of myself. I sense that competition authorities in Europe are a bit lost in the current climate, and I'm speaking at least for the country I'm based in and perhaps of the European Commission. So everybody says, of course, we have to join up this approach and bring together a competition with industrial and trade policy. There's lots of talks at conferences, at workshops, etc. But then I sense, it's just a feeling, that competition authorities are basically doing nothing now. They are just wait and see, waiting for a political direction. So can you convince me I'm wrong, that actually, and in the Netherlands at least, and maybe also elsewhere, there is this joined up approach makes a lot of sense. Martin.
Yeah, we're not lost. I think the truth is, of course, that we don't know exactly where to go. So probably, as always, when you ask a provocative question, you're half right, and I think that we have to acknowledge. What I do think is that a lot of the oxygen in the debate is being taken out by the discussion about whether or not to have European champions. And I think there's a lot of intellectual debate about European champions and the innovation defense and whether it should be cross-border or not cross-border and all these kinds of things. But as far as we are concerned, that is the ACM in the Netherlands, let's first talk about European options before we get to European champions. And I think we have, and that's what we face in a lot of markets, a lack of European options. It's not that we are talking that there is this near European champion. There's just simply no European option. That's the discussion that we have in digital. So let's think about creating European options. And what we see is that this is in a way, and not entirely, but in a way, it's also a coordination issue. We have, on the one hand, we have European buyers who say, yeah, we are interested in a European option, but there is no option. There is no European supply. And there are European suppliers who are saying, yeah, we could do this, but there is no European demand for our European supply. So this coordination issue, I think, requires a bit of out-of-the-box thinking for a competition agency. Because one of the ways to overcome this coordination issue is that you let coordination happen. Coordination at a horizontal level between competitors on the supply side and being competitors on the purchasing side, and vertically in the supply chain. And of course, that scares the you-know-what out of many competition authorities. And here, I think competition authorities have a role to play. We have a role to play in the sense that we can help companies and give comfort to companies to overcome this coordination issue for the greater good. And the greater good here is creating European options. And that is not a reduction of competition, but that is an increase of competition. And just for those of you who are not from the competition bubble, we've been here before. That is the ACM, your Authority for Consumers and Markets. Because a number of years ago, a lot of competitors were asking us as an agency, yeah, we want to do these fantastic new things to create more sustainable products and to do all these fantastic things, but the competition laws stand in the way. And what we did at the time, we said, okay, we will listen to you. And what we will do is we provide general guidance in a guidance paper on what you can and what you cannot do. And if you're still at a loss, come to us. Our doors are open and we'll be more than happy to talk to you. And if you don't want to come to us, but you follow in good faith our guidelines, we will not issue a fine. The worst that can happen is that we tell you to stop. So what we intend to do is address this coordination issue that we have now in creating European options in a similar fashion. It's too early exactly to tell how we are going to do that and when and what exactly the boundaries are. And this requires a discussion with the industry. What kind of guidance do they need from us? What kind of problems do they run into? And actually, and now you're asking, what are you actually doing? We are actually in discussion with sectors in where collections of buyers and collections of suppliers, European suppliers, are discussing how to create European options. This is one of the two things that we do. The other thing that we do is, again, for those of you who are not in the competition bubble, competition authorities have a wide discretionary power on where to deploy their resources. And in the previous years, and still at the moment, our resources were being deployed against market power in the digital economy, fostering the energy transition, and in as we as an authority did, and in helping to come to a more sustainable economy. Of course, we need to reconsider these three priorities in light of the current pressing issues in our societies and in economies, and that's what we are doing. And it could well be that we will redirect our resources to see what are the choke points in the supply chains. What are the thresholds or the entry and expansion barriers for European options, and see what we can do about that with our regular competition tools. So that means that it could well be that we will focus more on those supply chains that need to be opened up in order for European options to flourish when it comes to vendor lock-in, exclusionary conduct, financial incentives, interoperability, data portability. And yes, this is not immediately going to save the world, but it will help to create those European options in order to allow strategic or more strategic autonomy in key sectors. And that is the role that competition authorities, not only in the Netherlands, but throughout Europe, can play.
Thank you very much. I think you have convinced me, and that you are doing something in the Netherlands, and also creating European options is something I will remember. Thank you very much for that concept. Now I want to pass to Giancarlo. Gianca is a professor of economics currently at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata. Is an eminent scholar. Gianca has also been in the past very much involved in procurement. He was leading the economic research activity of CONSIP, which is the Italian central unit of procurement. So Gianca has seen all this on the ground, and they even managed, quite remarkably, to take away powers from a myriad of local purchasing agencies and have them centralized, because now there is currently a political problem that procurement, say procurement of defense, is done by 27 member states. And if you want to centralize it, done in Brussels or somewhere else, but done by Europe, it's not obvious that every single member state will want to delegate a central authority. So I would like to ask from Giancarlo his reflection of what he heard until now on Buy European, and how to organize procurement rules for this new dimension of the European economy. So Gianca.
Thank you very much for having me and for being the last speaker. Many of the points I plan to make have been touched upon before, but let's make Christina happy first. So I'm definitely in favor of a Buy European clause for strategic sector, well designed with the competence and the history of mistakes that we've been having the rest of the world in the past, in the hands of very competent designer that we don't have in the administration at the moment. However, I think I propose that from now on, we use the word Buy European always with two sides. One is we need to buy the funds to get to European innovators. Second, the procurement must be done at the European level. So buy European stuff at European level. We need the European market. We cannot hope to get national champion. This I disagree with Martin. If there was an idea of letting more coordination and concentration, you can get so-called champion by having very innovative startups funding a large integrated market in Europe through large procurement, centralized procurement, or you can let them coordinate and keep this. I don't think the second option is the good one. I think we need centrally run procurement agencies that breaks down, if there is the political will, the national forces that keeps keeping the market fragmented. Second, these policies are costly. Okay. By the way, another thing that Christian we like, the American had the Buy American Act since 1930s. and they went through WHO without problem. So these things can be negotiated within the WHO. So it's not that they are not possible. But we also have a very nice paper by Matilde Bombardini that show how costly it has been to keep jobs up with the Buy American Act that was only designed for employment. Same, we know we have a lot of literature that we say that say favoring some firms like small and medium enterprise in the US can be done in different ways and can be very expensive, less expensive, depending how you design. For innovation, it's going to be tricky. Every technology may require more or less bundling, more or less isolation, like in Indian reserves, or set asides, or may require just a subsidy. So we need an agency able to design schemes on demand for specific technology. So hyper competent, that goes to the concern that Dietmar raised. So we will need to change, adapt or change the legal framework that is entirely framed into the idea that we need to have competition at all costs. We need competition, and we can get it by centralizing large procurement, and so integrating demand, and thereby letting firms in different countries compete at the European level. This may bring some consolidation, but it compensated too. So the loss of competition from the set-aside can be compensated by integrated market. My major concern is the same one as Dietmar has. This procurement innovation requires public sector agencies that hire people like venture capitalists. Okay, I remember the last time I was consulted by a commissioner to work as an expert for an innovation project. They suggested that I could, they would offer like a 400 euros per day, support for expenses. And venture capitalists are busy. If they come here, work with us for a month on evaluating technologies, and we give 400 euros a day, probably they're going to be too busy. So, and the procurement staff and the bureaucratic staff that we have now is typically trained in law and in economics, but not in technology. So the bureaucracy that we have is risk averse, is not sufficiently skilled in market. We don't have revolving doors. We know that revolving doors is a problem, but revolving doors from the industry allows you to hire people that are experts. And this thing is even worse if you look at auditing bodies. The auditing bodies, like this is something that Dietmar already raised, the auditing bodies in Europe look at compliance with procedure. They don't care about the outcomes. That's my experience in research. It was, when I was in Mannheim with Stahl, we decided not to bid for any more European contracts for funding research because we're spending all the time at meeting deadlines on reports that nobody was reading. But the time at which a report was written and the number of pages had to be enough. Okay, this is the current culture at European bureaucracy. It must change. We need resources to change it. We probably need a different vehicle. But in my view, this is going to be more difficult to change than laws and things like that. So in some sense, reacting to what Ufo was saying, we need to create a procurement structure that is able to accommodate startups and small firms winning large contracts and then assisting them with scaling up, considering that we don't have venture capital in Europe. Okay, in US, life is easier. You have venture capital that work together with the public institution, and so small firms can grow and scale up. We have the problem that our small firms don't scale up. So one thing we can, I don't think the solution to this long-term innovation problem lies into consolidation of incumbents. Consolidation is, I think, is the wrong way to get our national champion. If we want a national champion like Apple and Google, okay, we want them to grow with a new idea and allow the new ideas to find the demand and the funding to grow. And in the absence of venture capital, we need power procurement, specially designed for them, to step in with very large auction. And there, dual sourcing may or may not be the best choice, depending on how large is the carrot. Because when you split the carrot in 2 or in 3 and 4, you may make more people happy, or you may take risks with different technology, and that's the good thing. But you also reduce the price and the carrot, and so you reduce the incentive and the ability to grow. So that will be a design dimension that will need to be taken case by case by extremely competent people that we don't have in the public sector at the moment. And that's my first take on these issues.
Thank you, Gianca. Thanks a lot. I see there's lots of...
Oh, sorry, about Consip. If you wanted me to talk about Consip, Consip was an extremely good experience because they had a lot of engineers there, but they couldn't work because of the legal sector. Okay, every ideas of the engineers was destroyed by the legal part of the concept because it was too risky. Because the risk, risk is the essence of innovation. We need an institution that has the mission to take risk and lose most of the project, as long as they took enough risk in a rational way. Because a strongly innovative procurement will mean that a lot of these proposals will be very risky. Some of them will fail, but the fail of a well-taken risk is a good for an agency like that, and should be recognized as being good by the auditor. So this requires really a shakeout of the whole system of public procurement. Sorry if I'm not talking too much. Well, state aids should help here. State aids, though, is actually good competition policy because it should limit the push on national tensions into defense, for example, and so on. At least if you have this large centralized procurement at the European level. Sorry if I talk too much.
Perfect, Gianca. Thank you very much. So you and Dietmar are quite consistent in saying that competence, culture, but also risk attitudes are key elements in this discussion. So there are a few questions in the chat, but also Christina will have a few more questions for the panelists. I've picked 2 questions first. There are 2 in particular that I would like to address now. One is more actually for Sanders. There's somebody saying there are sectors with the car manufacturing where we may provide subsidies that are going in the wrong way, say to Chinese manufacturers, and so how to deal with that. And so I'll pass it on to Sander. In the meantime, perhaps Ufuk and Dietmar can think instead of another question that was from Mike Walker, who's the chief economist of the CMA in the UK, who's saying that it's true that competition authorities don't know how to deal with innovation, but he's also perhaps rightly saying that the economics literature, at least the way it has percolated to the policymakers, doesn't provide a lot of guidance. So can we help as economists? Should we look at strategic management, or do we have to substantially rethink because they don't have much guidance from us, from the economists, on how to deal with innovation from a competition perspective? So first, Sander, if you don't mind addressing.
No, that's fine. You know, Tommaso, I love talking about autos, so I'm happy to talk about autos. So, I think it's important for all of us to realize that European car making is under severe pressure. And so whether you believe or not that politics should intervene to help the car sector, politics will intervene because there are 10 million European jobs at stake. And so I think our role as academics and thinkers is to make sure that governments do it in the best possible way. And I think there are 3 challenges from a competition standpoint that have percolated through all the interventions. One is, how do you do that without fracturing the European market? And second, how do you do that while staying open to your trade partners? And third, how do you do it without essentially avoiding regulatory capture and being too cozy with the car sector, which in some ways is the reason why our car makers are, at least from an innovation standpoint, in such a pickle. Now, I think the way out is picking up a bit on Giancarlo's point and Moritz and others, like how do you do that in a European way? Well, there is no European money to do consumption subsidies to basically steer European demand away from Chinese-made vehicles, which are already heavily subsidized and towards our own vehicles. But I think Europe can basically rig up a decentralized network of national subsidies using the state aid tool. So it would basically require the Commission to say, if Germany now reinstates EV consumer subsidies, Kaufprämien, then it needs to have a Buy European condition built in, so that you essentially avoid the question from Pablo Torres, which is your demand ends up actually going to China, not your own car making. The crux of that is that all European countries have exactly the same conditions, such that Buy European does not become Buy France or Buy Germany. And in fact, the French scheme to subsidize buying EVs has a very nice climate scoring conditionality, which rules out Chinese vehicles because they're built with coal-fired power, they're too far away. It includes French-built vehicles, but it excludes large vehicles, which de facto, rules out German-made cars and Korean-made cars, because they just tend to build larger EVs. So I think that's what you want to prevent. The simplest way to do that is if all European countries put in their EV subsidy schemes, Buy European or buy from the 72 free trade agreement partners that the EU has. That ensures market scale, and it ensures that you basically cut out China, which is a reciprocal, here we go again, symmetric response to China's de facto system of preferences. No European built car or battery has ever qualified for a Chinese subsidy. They cannot realistically complain if we have such a policy. It is a symmetric response to China's own policy. And if we don't do that, I mean, it looks quite dire, right? So China has manufacturing capacity to build 20 million vehicles, for which there is no demand in China. European demand is 10 million a year. So if they have the port capacity and the brand recognition, there is no European car manufacturing left in a couple of years. And so I think, we really need to think about the car sector hard, and it's difficult.
Thank you. Ufuk first, and then Dietmar. What do you think about the question of Mike about the lack of guidance from economics when it comes to innovation and competition policy?
Yeah, no, the point is well taken, but at the same time, I would like to also defend the literature a little bit. I think the literature has been quite productive, especially over the past decade, in using more and more microdata in order to understand the implications of, first, what are the incentives of different entrants into the market, what kind of technologies are they trying to produce, and what happens when they come into the market, what are they facing. And this entire literature on killer acquisitions, or the type of things that we also that I highlighted in the beginning in terms of the strategic poaching of critical players in the market, these are providing important smoking gun, and just sheer entry rate is not sufficient either, because we have to also look at the nature of innovation. In the past, a new entrepreneur or a new graduate from school wanted to build a company that will compete fiercely with an incumbent. Nowadays, they are hoping to be bought by the incumbent, which means that rather than being, a creative destruction, they are trying to be complementary to the existing technology, and that just adds to the market power of the incumbents. Which means that the measures that we are using, especially in competition policy, are backward-looking. We need to be more forward-looking in the sense that we have to think in dynamic terms. And all these, especially today, especially with the digital, the startups are very small in the beginning, but in just 5 years they become unrecognizable through their success. And if an incumbent, notices that early on, it will not be even above the threshold for the competition agency to detect the merger, because the value is too small in the beginning. As a result, it will not get detected. So, the first thing is, of course, being more connected and being in a closer dialogue with economists. But the second thing is, I think what I've been witnessing in competition agencies is that they are underfunded in general. And, given that, this is, there are lots of data now to utilize for policy making, or for also for understanding the nature of these type of activities. there are all these AI tools that are giving additional resources to everybody. Why not also policymaking using these type of tools? They are understaffed, and again, they are, most of the time what I've witnessed is that they are typically dominated by lawyers rather than economists, the competition agency. So that's why I think a closer dialogue and using also more recent tools and more forward-looking approach would be a step forward, I think.
Thank you, Ufuk. I thought also a key insight in what you said earlier, when we're thinking about innovation, it's important to think of who will be the superstars in the future. Instead, we have this obsession at looking at the current superstars, and we never think going forward. Dietmar, what's your take on this key issue?
First, let me sound support for what Ufuk just said, but let me also be a little bit self-critical of economics, because we can be terribly orthodox, right? So we need to understand the nature of innovation, and for that we need the communication with the technical side that generates that, because not everything fits automatically in Econ 101 and we hammer it into a template and then we push 3 Greek letters over a white page and that's it, okay? We also need to become better observers, better explorers of the phenomena, and engage then with these folks to give good advice. The second thing that I would say, and CEPR has thankfully done that, we need to take organizational economics far more seriously. We need to understand why bureaucracy is so lame in Europe, why it blocks each other. And that has to do with culture. That has to do with what was just said, with the dominance of legal thinking. And Giancarlo is completely right. If I only sort of monitor whether the process had been adhered to, and I don't look at the results, at the output, at what we care about, right? I get these terrible things. When I was a young student at Harvard, I took a class in organizational behavior at Harvard Business School. And I had a guy sitting beside me who was 65 years old. His name was Otto Broderick. Otto Broderick was the Comptroller General of Canada. And I asked him, what are you doing in this class with Lawrence and Lorsch and so forth, which was the classical organizational behavior book at that time? And he said, look, we can do monitoring and controlling in Canada wonderfully, and we kill all innovation. I am here to understand how we can allow for innovation. And I would like to see the European controllers and the ones from our Bundesrechnungshof take a class in how they can allow for innovation, because I think it's bitterly necessary.
Over to you, Christina.
Spicy takes or comments and questions related to them. The first one, and Mike won't mind, I think, as he's a friend. Mike, honestly, to say that we haven't got enough guidance from economists on innovation really makes my heart sink somewhat, because that's the standard kind of response. We haven't got enough sort of guidance from the IO literature. Come on, the standard out there that you should be talking to every day of the week. There are people out there like Dietmar. I don't care for an economic theory paper to tell me what to do. So I'm skeptical about that. Two, and this is a question really to Martin. So Martin, I completely agree with you that as well as kind of creating demand or steering demand towards buy European, of course we need to create supply, because the reason that the hyperscalers are everywhere is because they sell something which is integrated, is extremely good. It's a bundle that works, and it has a button that says, press me and I will work. And so Europe is fragmented, it hasn't got equivalent bundles and so on. But European suppliers are shrinking, they're small. So if you look at cloud, we are talking about something which is incredibly shrinking incredibly fast, and they're small. So in general, European supply is very fragmented. I personally would hope that competition authorities stay just out of the way. Just stay out of the way, because these kind of things need to happen in industry, need to be brought together, stitched together without any fear of, oh my God, are we creating a national champion? Are we creating a European champion? What's happening out there is that hyperscalers are eating our lunch every day of the week. So I would hope that competition authorities just go knitting somewhere else rather than standing in the way of this. Sorry for being blunt.
No, we know each other. I think we're saying the same thing, but maybe from a different angle. I agree with you that, if there is no European supply or the European suppliers are small and fragmented, why would competition authorities stand in the way? There is not the issue is not there. That's for sure. What I do say is that we get feedback both from buyers and from suppliers that, we want to consolidate our demand, we want to consolidate our supply, and you stand in the way. And we say, well, how come that we stand in the way? Yeah, our lawyers, our advisors, they tell us that, we should fear fines. And, our approach to that is, well, don't worry. And we'll be happy to tell you that you do not have to worry. We will not stand in the way. And that is exactly what we did. And that's why I make the analogy with the sustainability agreements. On the other hand, I fully understand, this is not going to change everything. So we play a role in this entire game, but we cannot create this. And we will, but the least that we can do is that, indeed, like you're saying, not standing in the way. And then the second point is, I saw in one of the comments, I think was Bronen, who was saying, yeah, but, who are you in the Netherlands? Which I completely understand. We are a small country, but the same thing, what happened with sustainabilities, I think the beauty of the decentralized European competitional network is that, I will go big word, regulatory innovations, regulatory experimentation in one country can move things in other countries in Europe. So that's what we do. So with the work that we do and the advocacy that we do, we also hope to inspire other European countries and the European Commission to follow a similar approach. And I think that is the spirit that we had with sustainability agreements and that we have at other topics as well. Actually, the European Competition Network is pretty strong and in the sense that it is open to learning experience in one country and adopt them in another country. And that goes into all directions.
Yeah, I have if I may, one last sort of comment that's very, very good, Martin. To a last comment to Giancarlo and to Dietmar. So Giancarlo in particular, you talk about the need for procurement to be essentially centralized at the European level. And that is one way, of course, that has got to happen. But decision-making is going to continue to happen at the national level. We know that industrial policy in Europe is run from Berlin, is run from Paris, is not run by Brussels. One can adopt procurement rules, but the spending is not decided necessarily centrally. It's done at the level of the national. How do you see this? These sovereign countries, Germany and France and so on, will have very clear respective views about how they want to implement by European. How do you see that coming together with your view that procurement needs to be centralized?
I don't think they will come together. I mean, I'm just saying there is a crisis here, okay?
Right.
Germany is too small to compete with China on certain high-tech stuff. So if Germany wants to lose the competition with China, the best thing it can do is to continue to behave the same way. This is a crisis, okay? To get innovative technology to scale up in the way they do it in US because of, there are venture capital integrated national market and export, or in China because of the huge subsidies, the integrated market. We need an integrated market in Europe. It's a crisis. One way to do it I will not say that all the public procurement should be shifted to Europe. I'm just saying that for essential, very circumscribed set of technologies that are crucial in terms of spillovers, in terms of the need for scale up, in terms of the need to support startups, because incumbents probably won't have the necessary incentive to disrupt technology. You need to stop this. I put 10 then you must buy 10 from my country, okay? That's the way European Space Agency is run. When I was consulting them for procurement, I was shocked to hear that every single cent spent, donated by Germany or by France was supposed to be spent on French firms and so on. If we go this way, we fail for this type of disruptive technology. If we are able politically to recognize that and break down on this and create it, I'm not saying that the Commission should run this scheme. The Commission doesn't have the skills and doesn't have the incentives. You need a new kind of framework, legal framework, organizational framework, but it cannot go ahead with its national interests. Countries are too small for having this kind of scale up. If they don't see this, we will fail in terms of catching up with these disruptive technologies. That's my view.
Christina, I don't think that's the only,
yes, exactly.
the only question. If I may quickly,
go
I know
ahead.
time is over, but I'm with Giancarlo. We need to realize that we are all in Europe tiny Switzerlands in comparison to China, and sometimes we just get into the illusion that we have special relationships, right? The Brits with the US and Germany with China and so forth. No, we don't. We need to realize that we're tiny and we need to aggregate. However, we also need to make sure that in that process, we don't make procurement so complex that startups, small firms, and so forth are completely screened out. We need to make use. We have instruments. We have pre-commercial procurement at the European Commission level. That instrument lay dormant until Sprint, the Agency for Radical Innovation, came and used it in order to finance technology development. So we have some options and we need to experiment more with them. And we should not be beaten out of experimentation by legal mindset.
Amen, I say. Over to you, Tommaso.
So thank you. There's lots of questions in the Q&A from very light ones, like it's ironic that we are hosting this debate on Buy European on Zoom, which is a US company, but I'm saying just wait until the next ones. Maybe the next result of this is that CEPR will adopt a different platform. There's also people pointing to initiatives already from civil society groups which are buying European. So let's look into those things already happening on the ground. And then there is the fundamental question of the political will to have this, centralized procurement, which will basically take away power from member states, a seismic shift, having a real European Union, politically speaking. And this is something that we cannot answer today, but I hope the debate was extremely interesting for everyone. I learned a lot, and I would like to thank all the speakers for being here. Thanks a lot to the audience and also to CEPR for giving us a platform for being here. Thanks a lot. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Excellent. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Take care, Tommaso.
Bye, Dietmar. Thanks a lot.